You can't accuse people of misinformation, which they did after Southport, while hiding information from voters, right? I want to know what impact mass immigration is having on our society. I want criminality data by nationality, immigration status, and visa type. I want welfare claim data. I want housing data. I want tax credit data. I want to know who's contributing what. Now, this is not about demonizing people coming to this country. It's about saying, as taxpayers, as people who are all struggling to get by, we're all working hard, we've got families, we're dealing with a crappy national health service, we can't get decent homes, we can't get decent places to rent, our kids have got almost no chance of getting on the housing ladder, public services are collapsing, the streets don't feel safe. These are questions ordinary Brits are asking themselves, and these are questions the mainstream media should be asking themselves. They're not, because it's a managed conversation, right? They want to speak to the 10 to 15% of people who don't see this as an issue.
We're on, we're live. Thanks for coming in, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Been really enjoying your Substack.
Appreciate it.
Learned a lot from it.
Thank you.
I pinged you recently because I particularly enjoyed your article, How Do You Take Back a Country?
Right, yeah, that was the discussion that we had with Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation. So he's like one of Trump's, I don't want to say advisors, but he's very influential in Washington.
Right. Well, I mean, I love the kind of concept, the idea of how do you take back a country in that. I tell you what, actually, it's quite funny. My son recommended a film to me the other night. We were watching, what was it called?
How old's your son?
Mid-90s, 20.
How old's your son?
Here, 20, that's him there.
Oh,
yeah. Mid-90s.
You don't look old enough to have a 20-year-old son.
Well, I shouldn't have had a 20-year-old son, but I was blessed and given a gift 20 years ago. So
I have a 3-year-old, so...
Have you? Other end of the spectrum, it does go quick. But he recommended this film. It was Jonah Hill directed, and it's just a coming-of-age film as a kid who's getting into skateboarding and finding his mates. And I was getting nostalgic, and Connor turned around to me and said... tell me if I get this wrong, but he said, Dad, I'm really jealous I didn't get to live in that era.
Right.
Because it was no mobile phones, skateboarding, and everything was kind of rational and normal.
Did you see that tweet recently about Gen X? What year were you born?
78.
So I'm 81.
Okay.
So Gen X, we're both basically Gen X. Although technically I'm a geriatric millennial. But anyway, Gen X.
I'm close to boomer.
Right. So Gen X voted overwhelmingly for Trump.
Yes.
And there was a meme recently that said, shock horror, the people who drank water out of hose pipes and played with random strangers on their streets don't want to be told what to do. And it was sort of this take that Gen X were really the ones that delivered Trump too, because they looked at all the woke stuff on the left and they were like, this isn't what we recognize from the 80s and the 90s. The 90s were the best decade ever. Yeah,
and don't get me, there were some weirdos, but like it was rare. It wasn't the norm. And
the 90s was freedom. That's the thing about the 90s. It was freedom. And, you had there were downsides. I mean, I really do think this. I mean, homophobia was pretty rampant. Yep. It wasn't, there was racism in football. Like it wasn't a great decade in that respect, but there was freedom in terms of culture. It was more interesting before the diversity, conformity stuff. You could really express yourself. In terms of art, in terms of writing. And like you say, anything pre-social media was great. Like the kids today who have grown up with social media and phones don't understand how liberating the era before that was.
Well, also, I left school with the firm belief I was going to start a business, which I did. I've started multiple businesses. I could buy a house. My dad had lent me $5,000 for a deposit for a house, which it's a small amount of money, which I could have saved up myself.
Yeah.
But I believed I could start a business. I wasn't scared about it. It was fairly easy to do. I'm now in a place I've got businesses. And I want to do more. And I just think, I can't be fucked.
Yeah, going to leave the UK, right?
Well, I did look into that. I did. I looked into Portugal.
Going to Estonia, 10% tax raise.
Well, I looked at Portugal, but then I said, do you know what? No. Like, the right and patriotic thing to do is try and stay and make a difference. We had this podcast we did out in the US, very successful, but I've come back and said, no, I'm going to do a podcast here because I want to deal with all this shit.
Yeah.
I want to contribute. But I even find now it's just, if kids want to start a business, it's so hard. They want to buy a house, it's so hard. And everything's just got fucking weird and stupid. So here we are.
No, I agree with that. I mean, it's the social contract stuff, the meme, the social contract, Nicholas, 30 years of age, what's he really paying for? The thing is, I mean, I know lots of people like that in Westminster, in London, who are working hard, playing by the rules, But, to be frank, they're getting screwed over in the housing market. They're getting screwed over by the intergenerational stuff. They're paying for baby boomers, Linda and John to go on P&O, but they're the ones also dealing with mass migration, basically the mainstreaming of crime, and a culture that isn't just boring, a culture that is basically anti-Britain, anti-West, anti-male, anti-white. And a lot of these young guys, particularly guys, women have gone sharply left, and we'll come back to that, but young guys, who are the Nicholas, the 30-year-old men, they're just saying, like, why am I staying here? Why am I putting myself through this? Now, when I was their age, and I went to a boys' school, and the lads I grew up with, like, we would never have said that at the time. Like, we believed fundamentally in the country, and we believed we could be prosperous in this country. I don't think our equivalents who are 25, 30 today feel the same way.
Actually, it'll be an interesting question to put to Connor. He's a bit younger. Sorry to do this, Connor, but do you have a thought of what British culture is or what we stand for?
No, not really. The most you get is in probably the World Cup, something like that.
Football, yeah.
Hooligans.
But that's the thing. I had Konstantin Kisin here yesterday, and I was talking about that. And I know what America stands for, which is freedom, liberty, and we're Americans. They, like the broad statement, anyone can be a success here. And I feel like we're about one or two administrations always behind them. But I know the same problems you're identifying with young men happen there. Well, you said it. I mean, the podcast tour that Trump and J.D. Vance did, I think was very good for them.
The most interesting part of Trump's campaign was when they embraced flagrant, the podcast culture, the kind of new media, because what they recognized, I mean, you can read it two ways. I've been told by people in and around Trump that at that point they knew they'd won anyway, so they were like experimenting. But the flip side of that is maybe they were embracing new media because they realized legacy media is so fundamentally broken and it isn't having the outreach that new media can have. I mean, I genuinely believe we're in the era of post-journalism. I was at the Spectator Awards the other night, and just looking around the room, the kind of legacy media class, a lot of those folks, I don't think, firstly, understand how much their industry is in crisis, how little people trust it. But I also don't think they understand how much reach new media is having and how much damage they've done themselves to their industry. Like, post-journalism refers to journalists who are no longer neutral, no longer objective. They've become hyper-political activists. We all know who they are. I could give you, we all know, I don't need to name them. But they were once maybe ensconced in the BBC, and now they've basically morphed within, 2 months into hyper-political left-wing activists. And what they don't understand is the damage they've done to the media by doing that, and I think that's one of the, it's great for people like you and me, because like with the Substacks, YouTube, our Substack has grown exponentially over the last 12 months. We're the biggest in the UK now. And I see these podcasts flourishing and shows like, Trigonometry and others, and it's wonderful, like all power to you guys. But the legacy media still, I don't think, have reflected on just how badly they've damaged themselves.
Well, I thought there were three really interesting points in that election in the US. And bear in mind, I'd been traveling to the US every 6 weeks or 7 years to make our podcast.
Right.
And I was coming back, the previous election, I was unsure about Trump. I'd kind of believed everything I'd read and heard. And
2024?
No, the previous election,
2016
actually.
The first one?
Yeah. I even did a podcast series called Chaos, which is about Trump and his administration. And it was interesting. We did some research. And then what happened, I kept going back and I kept thinking, well, hold on, what am I missing here? Why do so many people like Trump and, travel to red states? But what happened was there were three signals for me. There were two, actually four, because there were two with Trump. When he did Theo Von's show, and Theo Von talked about his cocaine addiction, and you heard Trump ask him really empathetic questions about him. It's like, okay, no, you're a human. You could see he cared. He wanted
because of his brother, right? He's seen addiction up close. But
you never get that side on kind of legacy media where they're given a few minutes here or there. Then there was a whole section when he did the Rogan interview, and I think they must have done about 30, 40 minutes on boxing and MMA. And I'm like, well, I love boxing. And so that was fascinating. And then there was J.D. Vance, the fact that I didn't know anything about him apart from something somebody sent me. It was either Vanity Fair or The New Yorker, which was very critical of him. Saw his 3-hour interview again with Rogan. I thought was superb. What a smart guy. But then the fact that Kamala wouldn't do these interviews. And I was like, okay, this tells me everything I need to know. It tells me everything I need to know coming to the UK, that I now need to hear Kemi do this interview. I loved hearing Nigel with Winston, and the fact that Rupert's just done Winston as well, and we're going to speak to Richard Tice.
I think I've done Winston twice. Yeah,
right. So you've got people now out talking
this podcast,
but if they're not doing, if I can't hear a 3-hour conversation with Kemi and get to know her or Keir Starmer, I don't know what I'm meant to think about them.
But I think the greatest asset resource in politics today is authenticity.
Yes,
that is the secret sauce. And if people sense you're not authentic, like let's say Keir Starmer, ratings already minus 32, that's kind of like Meghan Markle territory. If people sense you're not authentic, now in today's world, tribal allegiances have gone, right? They're not going to give you 2 minutes. And what Trump recognized early on, I think, is he was just like, I'm going to be myself. You love me, you hate me, I'm going to be myself. I think Nigel Farage is like that too. Mm-hmm. But the other interesting thing about America, listening to you talk, what's striking to me is the counterculture has become the culture.
Yes.
There was a picture recently of some young, attractive girls in a private members club in New York, and they were all wearing, red MAGA hats, which wouldn't have happened 6 months ago and wouldn't have happened a year ago, certainly wouldn't have happened 5 years or 8 years ago. Counterculture has become the culture. Trump is now the zeitgeist, right? And that's a really important point because the rebels are now seen as mainstreaming what is considered to be acceptable and cool. I mean, when you see Trump sat next to Dana White, RFK, JD Vance, Trump Jr., Elon Musk at a UFC fight, like as a guy, you're like, I want to be in that gang.
Fuck yeah.
Surrounded by, hot women, you're like, I want to be in that gang. Get me in. So what you've seen with the generational, like I'm a pollster, do a lot of work on voting and stuff. What you've seen with Gen Z, especially going quite hard for Trump, that's really about the cultural zeitgeist that's taking on a whole different shape now. Now, what's going to be interesting is, the publishing industry haven't realized that. The journalists haven't realized that. The legacy cultural institutions, the museums and the galleries haven't realized that. And what starts in America, comes elsewhere. When America sneezes, Europe catches a cold. So I think that cultural shift is going to be really interesting.
Well, that's interesting in itself, in that, sometimes if you're certain people, you have to pick your words carefully when you start talking about Trump in the UK. It feels like
I'm really pro-Trump now.
Well, so I mean, I won't not talk about Trump, but I try and think about. I have this thing in the back of my mind. I'm always thinking, how do I convince leftists they're wrong? How do I convince them that I understand their objectives? I understand what socialists want to do, but ultimately it's self-defeating. How do I bring them along? So I try and think about how I explain these things to them. But we're in this position where, Trump won everything.
Clean sweep.
Won everything. Yet here in the UK, it feels like about 90% of the people still think he's the second coming of Hitler. Even watching Rory Stewart, and I expect it from Alistair fucking Campbell, but even watching them lose their shit over Elon and Trump, to me, it's like, how are you missing this? And I think, like Konstantin said to me yesterday, it's because they haven't spent enough time there.
Well, I think that's one thing. I'd add a few other things to that. Okay,
sure.
I mean, the first thing to say is, you remember when Michael Gove, a conservative, new editor of The Spectator magazine, someone asked him, who would you support? He said Kamala Harris. And there was a big chunk of the Conservative Parliamentary Party and the liberal British establishment who were basically pro-Harris, couldn't bring themselves to vote for Trump, which was utterly ludicrous as a conservative to vote for Kamala Harris. Michael Gurry, who wrote a fantastic essay on this, I think in the Free Press before the election, he said, look, fundamentally, what this election is about is freedom. You've got one side that want to limit freedom, that want to impose speech codes, that want to politicize the institutions, that basically want to narrow the public square. And you've got another side, whatever your personal views about Trump, who want to maximize freedom, who want to push back against woke ideology, who also want to strengthen the borders, the boundaries of the garden so we can have, genuine prosperity flourishing, who want to take on, the kind of hard left zealots. And if you just looked at this election through the prism of freedom, as I did, it was never close. But the other thing to say is, most people today, unfortunately, and to maybe build on what Konstantin's saying, because I know Konstantin does this, but lots of other people don't, is very few people read now. Our attention spans, I believe, Johann Hari has nailed this point. I think our attention spans have been completely decimated by smartphones. Mm-hmm. I don't think people read. I don't think they're even aware of what parties and politicians are saying, hence the rise of vibe-based politics, which is complete lunacy. Like, no one's even reading policies anymore. Nobody's even interested in what politicians are saying. And if you had have read what they were proposing, like, it wouldn't have been close. I mean, Trump was just simply the more compelling, articulate, serious, effective politician compared to Harris, who said almost nothing at all. And what she did say was terrifying around the borders, around, wokeism, geopolitics. I mean, she shouldn't have been president. She certainly shouldn't have been vice president. And it's that kind of erosion of our collective knowledge that is one of the most worrying developments that I've seen, and probably you've seen in your lifetime.
Yeah.
People used to read seriously. You would go to people's homes and there would be, books next to their bed. Now, people lie in bed just scrolling reels. And it's like the decimation of our culture. And that is what concerns me more than anything.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
Yeah, I think, I 100% agree with you. I think there was a strong signal, though, through this election that the important people who do read, your Mark Andreessens, your RFKs, your Vivek Ramaswamys, your Joe Rogans, your intellectual, well-known people of influence in various categories of business and culture all shifted. And it's like, sometimes you have to take a pause and go, hold on a second, why have you all shifted? Yeah. And I think that becomes a signal for people. But I also I go back to the podcast thing. I think in some ways the long form podcast has become the new reading. In that, for example, I bring an author on here, I can spend 3 hours, 2 hours talking to them and find out about the book, everything they stand for and what they've written about, and understand them as a person, what they stand for, without having to read the book. And I've done that a lot of times. I haven't read the book because I've done the interview. And I think other people get to listen to those interviews as well. But you can't hide in a 2-3 hour interview.
Sure.
You can't get away. You can't prep. I might give you some topics we're going to talk about. Same with someone like if I had a Kemi in here. But they can't hide from my questions. They're going to get tough questions and they're going to be exposed with that. And so that brings back to that authenticity that you spoke about. I just think about the UK, and I think one of the challenges we have, I keep talking about this, I don't think we have a culture of freedom like the US does. I don't think we have enough people who fundamentally believe in the importance of free speech and fundamentally agree with in free expression and fundamentally agree with property rights. All those basic foundational pillars of liberty. I don't think we have that. I think it's coming. And I think people are starting to realize it, but I don't think we have it like the US. And I think that's a big challenge.
Oh, absolutely. I've seen that most prominently in the universities with higher education, where basically free speech, the national conversation, the public square has been dramatically curtailed and narrowed down because we've had the imposition of speech codes.
Yeah.
We've had the imposition of what we would have called in the 80s political correctness, or what today they would call cancel culture.
Yeah.
Now, every metric we have, every survey, every study shows it's been getting worse, and it's probably going to get worse because Gen Z are more supportive of limiting free speech than any other generation. And I find that worrying. But free speech is something that I think we just don't talk enough about, but also what are the vehicles for promoting that? So I do a lot of work on GB News, right? And I get a lot of crap from people in my life because I come from the elite institutions, I've come from the universities, right? And a lot of people there will say, they'll look down on this, how could you go on GB News or whatever? But actually, what you find is, I also used to do a lot on the BBC. So the BBC will give you very managed conversation. So if this was a discussion on the BBC, I'd say, well, tell me what's your view on, housing crisis? And as you're talking, if I were Nick Robinson or Emily Maitlis, I'd be like, come on, you've got like 30 seconds here. Like, let's keep doing, There's no free-flowing conversation. There is no serious dialogue in legacy media, right? It just doesn't happen. They've even just scrapped shows like Hard Talk as an example of that. Now, on GB, or if we're in France or Germany or something like this, you would have long-form discussion, which is, about, in turn, preserving and passing on the culture and the inheritance and all of the things that we talk about. And I think it's because legacy institutions are just no longer capable of having serious conversations about things that challenge their ideological priors. Jonathan Rauch calls this the constitution of knowledge, that our civilization is based on this constitution of knowledge, but the parameters of that are determined by the elite class. So if we were to go off script for a minute and I was to give you my thesis as to why I think mass immigration is a disaster, which I do, in the legacy media, that is violating the constitution of knowledge and the parameters of that. So they would say, whoa, hang on, let's bring that back over here. Let's move the Overton window back over here. And I think that's what people can sense, that, and they can sense the way in which they're being managed. And today in Britain, people are being managed. We saw it most visibly during the Southport atrocities. People are being managed. They're not actually being told the truth, and they don't want to participate in this charade anymore. They want people to be authentic. They want their leaders to tell them the truth, and they want their leaders to represent their values and their voice in the institutions, rather than just cater to the preferences of the top 15, 20% of people in the elite class. Those days, I think, are done.
So you believe, you wrote about it, but do you believe, therefore, we are in the midst of this populist revolt, and this is just part of it?
Oh, I think we're in the midst of a fundamental reconfiguration of politics in the West. So my thesis from the early 2000s has been, essentially, we had a century of left and right politics, Labour versus the Conservatives, right? Basically, from the 1900s to the 2000s. Sometimes
a healthy tension.
Yeah. Two-party politics, like left and right, arguing mainly, not exclusively, but mainly about the economy.
Yeah.
My thesis is that as we've gone into the 21st century, remember, mass democracy is only 100 years old, really, as we know it. It's a very young experiment. People assume we've always had democracies and political systems. We haven't. But my thesis is what we have started to see in the first 20 years of the 21st century with Trump, with Brexit, with Marine Le Pen, who just brought down a government in France, with the AfD in Germany. My thesis is basically that this is the beginning of a long-term transformation of politics, which is going to see the left-right axis flip, and we're going to have increasingly conservatives against liberals on issues around culture, belonging, and identity. Chris Lash, some of your viewers might know this guy, very influential person for me. He was an academic, and he wrote a great book. I would urge everybody to go and read it. 1993. The book was called Revolt of the Elite. And he wrote it on his deathbed. He was dying from cancer. And he wrote a number of other great books, and he's just a very influential academic. But his thesis then, remember, 93, when you and I were getting into lad culture and Oasis and all of that, even then, long before Trump and Brexit and everything, he said, the next big revolt in politics will not be the masses rising up against the elites. It will be the elites rising up against the masses, because they won't be able to contain people. So they will try and control them. They will try and curtail them. They will try and tell them they're misinformed. They will tell them they're garbage, they're bigots. They will try and shut down the public square. They will try and take control of the institutions. And what we're seeing, I think, through the rise of Trump and Brexit and Le Pen and so on, is people saying, no, basically, fuck that. We're not going to have this project being imposed on us. So my thesis, I hate, I'm not rubbing it in people's faces, but the last 25 years, it's been pretty accurate. And we've seen it here too with reform.
Yep.
We've seen it with Nigel Farage. That's someone I know very well. I'd say, Nigel's a friend of mine. I think what we're going to see here between now and 29 is something similar. We're going to see that continuation of the realignment of politics as reform will likely step up and say, okay, Labour and the Conservatives no longer speak for a majority of people, the forgotten majority in this country. We need a different politics.
So this is really, it's disruption, right? It's disruption of politics. With the advent of the internet and mobile phones, we've had a disruption of pretty much every major industry. We've had a disruption of publishing. We've had a disruption of journalism. We've had a disruption of media. I mean, I've been actively involved in the topic of Bitcoin for the last 8 years. That's the disruption of money, and that's also winning. We can get into that if you ever want to talk about that. But I don't believe we've had the disruption of politics yet. What we have had that's different from my childhood is my view on politics of my childhood came from my father, and I suspect his came from the 6 o'clock news and whatever paper he read. But we didn't have the free flow of information, so God knows what bollocks that was hidden from us. Now we have the free flow of information. We have politicians being community noted on Twitter. We have people have long-form interviews, as we talked about. We've had this kind of much more free flow of information and ideas, where I don't think politicians can hide, which is probably one of the big things that is driving the need for a disruption of politics. And I say that need because I grew up with my dad as a conservative. I've only ever voted conservative, but I didn't vote in the last 3 elections because I kind of lost interest. I felt politically homeless. But we've seen a terrible Labour government come in, and I believe Kemi's first however many days have been mainly boring and ineffective, and if they were to win the next election, I think it would be much the same. I actually think the Conservative Party itself is pretty left-wing in many ways as well, not completely a Conservative Party. So I'm looking at the US, I'm saying, right, Trump, Elon, Vivek, Tulsi, RFK, that's disruption. It's a promise at the moment. We'll see if they deliver. But it's the kind of disruption I want to see here. Pure disruption of politics.
I think the first thing I would say is when you talk about disruption about the institutions, which I'll come back to, there's been another fundamental source of disruption, which has been migration, which has been the disruption of our home. Essentially what we've done is we've allowed, if you think of the nation as a home, which is, how Roger Scruton, the conservative philosopher, once talked about it, we've basically taken the locks off. We've left the front door open. We've allowed people from outside of Europe to flood in with different values, different cultures, different ways of life, often with no regard around respecting our laws, contributing to the collective pot. And we've left much of our country feeling unsafe and insecure. Now, that is the biggest source of disruption that is going to characterize Western nations for the next few centuries, right? Migration and demographic change is going to be, as we're talking now, immigration is the number one issue in Britain. It's only going to become more central to politics. So that, for me, is the biggest source of disruption. The other thing is, you talk about your dad and his dad. I'm similar, but in a different way, in that everybody historically on my mother's side of the family, and actually to some extent on my father's side of the family, voted Labour. Historically, I come from working class neighborhoods of Salford, with my parents, my grandfathers, great-grandfathers working in steel factories, really blue collar, and from South Wales working in the coal mines. And that's a kind of backstory. Now, all of those, my ancestors would have voted Labour because their dad voted Labour and their dad voted Labour. But the other story about disruption is, that has gone. Tribal allegiances have gone. So what we have now is this era of volatility where over the last 10 years, 60% of people in Britain flip their vote from one party to another, Conservative, Labour, Lib Dem, Reform. In that context, where you have no tribal allegiances, people are now looking at politics like shopping, right? Like, I'll have a bit of that, maybe a bit of that. It becomes impossible to predict, right? All the old rules are gone. So then you're much more reliant on things like charisma, campaigns, and issues cutting through. And again, that's where authenticity and things come into play, because people are not willing to just go along with the old tribal allegiances of old. And also, our expectations of politicians have gone up. We expect more, we demand more. And at the same time, the quality of politicians has deteriorated. And the people who often like to think of themselves as kind of an oracle in politics, like Rory Stewart, are not even that impressive themselves. I mean, the fact of the matter is most of the people who dominate the conversation about politics in this country were the same people who presided over the disastrous, failing elite consensus that has shaped this country for the last 30, 40 years. Everything you see when you walk out this front door, everything you see was shaped by Labour and the Tories. Big immigration, big state, big tax, big debt, big regulation, big on woke, big on London, not really interested in much else. That is basically what I would consider to be the elite consensus.
Let's not forget surveillance.
Or big on surveillance. That's what I would consider to be the elite consensus. If you step outside of that, as say Nigel Farage has done, I certainly do on the Substack regularly, you are framed as not just a disruptor, but as fundamentally problematic, right? Somebody to be thrown out of the public square. The difference now, of course, as you say, is we're not all sat in front of the TV watching BBC or choosing between 4 channels. So people are not going to tolerate that strategy from the elite class anymore. I saw that after Southport, because I was one of only a few people who said, this is clearly about immigration, lack of control of borders. And the elite class were like, oh no, it's about what somebody read on a tweet. This is all about, all the riots and protests is about what people read on Twitter. Like, it was completely nonsense. They can't control the conversation anymore. That's the key point. They can't control the supply of information anymore. So when they say to you, well, you're misinformed, people can say, well, hang on a minute. I'm just going to go and listen to this guy's podcast, or I'm going to read this guy's Substack, or I'm not misinformed. You're gaslighting me. And that is how I see the public conversation today. People can sidestep the elite class in a much quicker and more efficient way than they could have done 10, 20, 30 years ago.
I reckon about 75% of the people I've spoken to recently in my cohort of friends, I live in Bedford, right. Definitely middle class.
I'm in Bedford. I grew up in St Albans.
Ah, okay, yeah, on the same train line. Are either saying they're going to vote reform or they're thinking about reform, but it's very much a one-to-one private conversation. There's still a little bit of kind of like, am I meant to admit this? Can I admit this? but and I think the reason being is everything else has let them down, and so I definitely want to talk about immigration with you because I don't know enough about it. But I just want to stay on the populism bit at the moment. You will listen to the rest of politics, or you will. I
don't listen to the rest of politics.
I do because I want to know what they're thinking. I started out liking it, then I started to... I mean, I've never really liked Alistair Campbell because I think we all know why we don't like Alistair Campbell, but it was really interesting to hear two people talk about subjects who are meant to be from different ends of the spectrum. I think they're just slightly either side of the middle. But it was interesting. But I started to get really suspicious. I was like, hold on, all you're doing is defending the bullshit, the status quo.
Of course.
And this is just establishment talk to me. But...
That left and right are indistinguishable now.
Well, to me,
and that's the point. As you hit the nail on the head, much of the Conservative Parliamentary Party is further to the cultural left than the average Conservative voter. In fact, most Conservative MPs are closer to Labour MPs on cultural and identity issues like migration and woke and borders and so on than they are to their own voters. And this is why Nigel Farage and Reform and so on are doing really well. Most of the podcasts in this country, as you know, which is, I suspect, why you're doing well with this one, most of the podcasts are created by and cultivated for no more than maybe 15% of the country. If I were to take radically progressive values, comfortable with immigration, comfortable with net zero, socially liberal, a bit left on culture, that is about 15% of the British population, right? The British Social Attitude Survey says actually only about, at maximum, 20% have strongly and consistently liberal values, 20%, which means if you're leaning into the 80%, which is what I would say this conversation might be doing, GB News might be doing, my Substack is doing, then suddenly people are like, oh God, actually someone is representing my voice in this conversation. I don't have to pretend that, Emily Maitlis and Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart are somehow representing Britain, because they're not. What they're representing is no more, it's an elite minority of 15 to 20% of the country, because the institutions haven't reformed themselves. That's the problem is the institutions have become politicized. So Kevin Roberts, who I mentioned from America, kind of close Trump ally, president of Heritage, he has a really good analogy about this. He does a lot with fire out in, he's a fisherman, he likes to go hunting and so on. And he uses the analogy of a controlled burn. So if you have a big forest fire that's going to decimate everything, going to destroy everything in its wake, how do you stop that fire, right? And think about the fire for a minute. Think about the fire as like, woke ideology or whatever. You start a controlled burn. You start a smaller fire just ahead of it. And that smaller fire sucks up all the fuel and the oxygen that would have gone into this complete devastation. So you manage a controlled burn. And what Kevin is saying is if you look at all of the institutions in the West, legacy media, universities, galleries, museums, schools, New York Times, FBI, etc., etc., etc. What you need to do now with Trump 2, and I would argue reforming the state here in Britain and Europe, is you need a controlled burn. You need to basically intervene, which historically conservatives have refused to do because they're kind of weak and non-interventionist. You need to intervene and you need to level the playing field. And you say, we're not going to tolerate this mass devastation of our identity, our culture, and our history anymore. We're going to intervene. We're going to have laws that protect and promote free speech. We're going to have laws that say, okay, if you're the BBC and you want to impose a political project on us, you can do that on your own time. You're not having taxpayer funding for that. If you're schools and you're teaching kids that little boys can become little girls and little girls can become little boys, right, sorry, we're not going to tolerate that. That's violating your political impartiality and neutrality. And you can go around all the institutions and you can do it like that. I think Kevin's exactly right. It's about bringing together a generation of politicians who say, no, actually, we're going to have a controlled burn of the institutions.
So I didn't get to the point I did, and I've got questions on that. I want to ask you why that's happened. Actually, let's do that first. Is it that we have just inauthentic, career-driven politicians with a lack of integrity and backbone that really just want to keep their seats safe and keep their position safe? Is that what it is? Have we got a complete government full of pussies? Excuse my term, but is that it?
I think one of the problems is almost all of the institutions now have been flooded by people who went to the same schools, the same universities, and often share the same values and the same political priorities. And that, it's not always the case. You can point to your Labour MP that doesn't quite fit that and so on. But you basically have, over the last 20, 30 years, the institutions have been sort of dominated by people who talk endlessly about diversity, but are actually not that diverse at all when it comes to their values and their beliefs. So we need to reform the institutions. We need to have a much greater range of voices in those institutions. Okay, that's one of the things. And I think the second thing is, as I said earlier on, I think the parameters for our culture that kind of shape the national conversation have just become so narrow. The Overton window has become so narrow that we're not even capable of tolerating a serious conversation about something that lies outside of that, because how you create and cultivate culture has become, so carefully managed, like it is a play, but it's orchestrated and managed in a very stifling, suffocating way. So if you look, for example, take the issue of immigration, which we'll come on to, you can't really have a sensible, mature conversation anymore about that issue because the culture just won't allow that. I mean,
you can't in certain areas have that conversation.
I don't think you could. Where could you have a serious, long-form conversation on mainstream media?
That's it, on the mainstream,
in Britain about how migration is changing our country? Where could you have that conversation?
I think the only place you could, not long form, but I think pretty much the only place is Question Time.
But no, Question Time, if I'm lucky. Well, I'll give you an example. Firstly, if you get on Question Time, you're lucky if you get a soundbite. There's no long form conversation.
No, not long form, but
and
it's
secondly,
the only place.
Even Question Time is carefully managed.
Of course.
I don't want to turn this into, the Matt Goodwin show, but Question Time is a great example because the selection of guests is so carefully managed in a way that it doesn't challenge the zeitgeist.
Have they not had you then?
I've never been on Question Time. I've been on every other show except Question Time, which is the flagship political discussion. You have to ask yourself the question, why?
Well, but that's why, we're going back to the point. That's why the rot exists. They're trying to keep a balloon underwater, and these conversations happen elsewhere. That's why when Rupert Lowe goes on to Winston Marshall, I don't know, what was it, 600,000 people watched that?
Rupert is an incredibly impressive member of Parliament. But you see, the fact that we find Rupert impressive speaks volumes about how weak our political class has become. What Rupert is doing, interestingly, around issues like he's got this campaign to get them to release information and data, which interestingly started on our Substack, and we worked with Reform MPs to basically say you can't accuse people of misinformation, which they did after Southport, while hiding information from voters, right? I want to know what impact mass immigration is having on our society. I want criminality data by nationality, immigration status, and visa type. I want welfare claim data. I want housing data. I want tax credit data. I want to know who's contributing what. Now, this is not about demonizing people coming to this country. It's about saying, as taxpayers, as people who are all struggling to get by, we're all working hard, we've got families, we're dealing with a crappy National Health Service, we can't get decent homes, we can't get decent places to rent, our kids have got almost no chance of getting on the housing ladder, public services are collapsing, the streets don't feel safe, we've basically got mainstreaming, we're mainstreaming shoplifting and gang violence. I think the least we can do is give taxpayers information about how this experiment, which is what it is, it's an experiment, no one's ever done this before, how it's changing our society. Now, what Rupert Lowe from Reform has been doing with Nigel Farage has been going into Parliament and he's been saying, right, I want this data. And he's now beginning to get data, and we're beginning to find some bloody shocking stuff, like 40,000 criminal offences were committed in this country over the last 4 years by people who should otherwise have been deported, who had avoided deportation, and they went on in 4 years to commit 40,000 criminal offences, right? Now, I don't think that's xenophobic to talk about it. I think that's just, okay, we should talk about this. Why have we got 40,000 criminal offences being committed in this country by people who should otherwise have been deported? Why have we got 11,000 foreign national offenders in our prisons, but we can't find space in our prisons? Why aren't these people removed from the country? These are questions ordinary Brits are asking themselves, and these are questions the mainstream media should be asking themselves. These are questions that Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell should be asking. They're not, because it's a managed conversation, right? They want to speak to the 10 to 15% of people who don't see this as an issue, whereas the forgotten majority do see it.
Because they're elites, it doesn't affect them.
Because they're hyper-liberals.
And it doesn't affect them.
No, firstly, they're hyper-liberals, and as John Haidt and other psychologists have shown, they just can't deal with stuff that challenges their worldview. The second is they're part of the luxury belief class. They're not going to pay the consequences of this experiment. It's not their kids who are going to be gang raped by grooming gangs in Northern England. It is not, it is not the elite class that is going to have to try and compete with 25 other people in London on average to rent an apartment, right? While we're flooding the country, net migration is now, what's recently nearly 1 million a year. I'll give you one. I could talk all day about this, but I'll give you one example.
Yeah, no, go on.
Keir Starmer has just said one of his priorities is to build 1.5 million homes, right? While saying absolutely nothing about migration. Why do I talk about migration so much, right? According to analysis by the Centre for Policy Studies, we need to build 800,000 homes. 800,000 homes just to keep up with the demand for migration. So Keir Starmer's out there saying, pat me on the back, I'm going to build 1.5 million. Well, great. More than half of those homes are actually coming as a result of migration. This was from the Substack we just did, which went viral.
Okay.
So this is showing you the history of net migration, the blue columns, since 1948 until today, okay? This is net migration, okay? So what you're seeing, basically, is what I would call an extreme experiment, which is what it is. We now have consistently net migration above 700,000 a year.
So until 1984, ironically, we had negative net migration.
So basically we had net migration. We had more people leaving the country than coming in, and then it averaged around 50-odd thousand until Tony Blair starts the big experiment with mass immigration. Those of us who are in Gen X and above will remember free movement, 2004. That then becomes a major talking point, but net migration then is only around 200,000, right? Which even then we were like, wow, these are huge numbers. Now look what's happened since COVID. Now, the other thing about those massive blue bars where you've got net migration at basically nearly 1 million, last year we had 1.2 million people migrate into Britain, which is the size of Birmingham. Okay, 1.2 million, okay? What's happened is not only have the numbers gone completely bonkers, which is why, Gen Z British kids are like, how am I ever going to get on the housing ladder? But the other thing that's happened, 86% of that migration since COVID, 86% has come from outside Europe. So here's my other question. Even if you say, Matt, I'm not sure I find your arguments about the economics convincing, right? The fact that only 15% of people coming in are coming in on work visas, the rest are relatives and students, that I would argue aren't really contributing to the economy. Like, they're not really driving prosperity. They're not the engineers, they're not the scientists, they're not the wealth creators. Even if you said, okay, I don't agree with you on the economics, here's another question. If 86% of record levels of migration, if 86% is coming from outside Europe, often from mainly Muslim countries, often from countries with radically different cultures, values, religions, and so on, How the hell are we going to keep this country together over the next 50 years, 100 years? How are we going to get the social cohesion, the cultural glue, the integration that is going to keep this country that we once knew going, functioning, thriving? Because, really respected professors, Robert Putnam at Harvard, 10 years ago, wrote a paper, caused an absolute shitstorm in the universities, where basically, everyone is kind of woke on steroids. And Putnam wrote a paper, really, really good paper, because he said, if you subject people to this level of migration, the first thing that goes is social trust. People just don't trust anybody anymore. They don't trust the institutions, because there's a perfectly rational reason, right? Why would you? If you don't know your neighbor, why would you contribute to the welfare state? If you don't know the person who's coming in, or even worse, they're coming in and they're breaking the law and they're committing murder or rape, or, they're robbing people's houses, why would you contribute to the NHS? Why would you trust anybody in your society? And what Putnam said was the end result, if you're not careful, is a low trust, yes, highly diverse, but low trust society where people hunker down and they turn away from their neighbor. Now, that's not the Britain or the England I know.
Yeah.
The Britain and the England I know and I grew up with in the 80s and the 90s was the opposite of that.
Yeah.
It was high trust. It was friendly. It was outgoing. It was fun. We had a laugh. Now, Britain and England to me feels on edge, feels tense. Feels a bit dark, feels a bit dystopian. And I think we can all sense that the culture and the demography now are heading in the wrong direction. And I'm afraid to say, Kemi Badenoch and the Tories, they did as much to create this disaster as the Labour Party did. Both left and right were complicit in doubling down on mass migration when 70% of people in this country said, we don't want this policy. We don't want you to do this. They did it anyway.
It's very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Right. So I told you before we start, I don't know enough about immigration. And so it's probably one of my areas I'm weakest on. And probably, as I said to you, not just in terms of my knowledge and understanding of immigration, but also the things I'm hardline are usually about the economy. I'm not particularly hardline on this because I don't know enough about it. And I grew up, I think one of the reasons, growing up in Bedford, it's a very multicultural town. As long as I've known, there's been a massive Italian community, a massive Indian community. All I've ever known is quite a multicultural town. And Bedford's never really had integration issues. People do just get on well with each other. But at the same time, I'm very aware there are issues across the country. So we've gone to net migration of high hundreds of thousands, tipping over to 1 million at one point. What is the makeup of these numbers? Where are they coming from? And what are the permissions required to be here?
Well, there are two stats you just need to know, basically.
Illegal and illegal, by the way.
Yeah, so let's just talk about legal migration, right? People are coming here legally through visa routes. If you believe people in Westminster, they will say these people are coming here to work and they are making us richer. That's rubbish, right? They're lying to you.
Okay.
15%, of all migrants from outside of Europe, which is most of the migration, over the last 4 years came in on what's called the skilled worker visa. 15%. You might say, well, Matt, who are the others? The relatives of workers, international students who often come to do a 1-year MA and then they transition over to a kind of a visa that allows them to work in, Deliveroo or McDonald's. I mean, these are not high-skilled jobs. Refugees, asylum seekers. And so why this matters is if you say to me, Matt, I'm getting hammered by the economy, why are you talking about migration? Well, I would say because this form of migration that we're having now is actually eroding the economy. It's making you poorer.
How?
Right. So firstly, we're flooding the economy with low wage, low-skill migrants who are often, when they are working, are earning less than average. So what we're doing is we're flooding the economy with people who are basically consuming. They're like, going shopping or they're doing stuff, but they're not actually driving productivity and prosperity. They're not actually, building big companies or, working in high level, well-paid jobs. They're basically giving big business cheap labor. So we've created a Ponzi scheme where if you're Starbucks or McDonald's or you're Deliveroo, you love it. You've got all the guys on bicycles in the world, right? You've got all the cheap labor in the world. That's helping you keep your costs low and your profits high. But as a country, the reason our growth rates are so bad, and the reason our GDP per capita numbers, which is basically growth per person, is so bad, the worst since the 1970s, because we flooded this marketplace with cheap workers. So
I'm not sure I agree with that.
What?
Well, I also think, I think there can be a number of reasons why GDP growth is low. I think it also can come down to the fact that, I think our tax as a percentage of GDP is the highest it's been for something like...
Yeah, it's basically since the Second World War.
And so, I know as a business owner and a business operator, the more money you take off me, the less businesses I set up and the less I... So I think...
that's part of the story. Yeah. But also, as you know, as a business owner, if you have endless amounts of cheap labor, you're never going to innovate. You're never going to automate. I'll give you one example. Car washes. You and I, similar, we're the same age, basically. Yeah. We remember automated car washes.
Yeah,
you'd go in and a machine would clean your car. Automation. Now, you go and you have your car washed and there's like 15 Albanians. Right, most of whom, to be frank, will be illegal. You go down the high street, sweet shops, barbers. A lot of those are money laundering operations. The point I'm trying to say is the model. I'm not against immigration per se, but we need much less of it, and it needs to be high skill, and it needs to work in the interests of British people, and it needs to come from culturally compatible nations. Right, we come back to that. But what we've got at the moment is this mass low skill, low wage migration, which is eroding prosperity. Everyone is now realizing this. Even Justin Trudeau in Canada has come out and said, this isn't working. Sweden has come out and said, this ain't working. We've actually now got massive amounts of gang violence and people from very different countries throwing grenades around in downtown Malmo. This isn't working for us. And the elite class slowly is coming to understand that what they've done is pretty disastrous. The only people who haven't realized that are the elite class in Britain. And let me just push back on you with one other thing. Here's what I find completely bananas about all of this. Boris Johnson came out in 2019 and said, we're going to completely use our new freedoms post-Brexit and we're going to have this high-skill, low-migration economy. What they then did is they removed the requirement for British companies to advertise jobs to British people before anybody else. So you could advertise jobs in India before you showed them to British people, which, is bonkers in my mind. But they also completely liberalized the whole system so people could come in, bring their family relatives, work in jobs where they earn less than the average wage, and then later apply for indefinite leave to remain, as in stay here forever. Now, I don't think that model works for anybody. We want people who, Britain is famously tolerant and we welcome people from outside the country, but only so long as they respect the rules of our society, they contribute to the collective pot, they respect our identity, our history and culture, they don't try and establish a parallel legal system, a parallel culture, they integrate into who we are, right? And then in turn, they become part of the story of who we are. What we have got is something completely different now. We've got people refusing to integrate. We've got 150,000 people coming illegally on the small boats across the channel. We've got 86% of all migration from outside of Europe, from countries that are as different from Vietnam to Uzbekistan. This is creating a society that is going to be low trust, segregated, and it's not going to be prosperous. You and I both have kids. We want to be thinking about where is this society 50 years from now?
The thing I don't understand is, I was watching Dispatches the other night. I know there's been some criticism. I haven't fact-checked it myself. But they talked about 8 to 9 million people unemployed
Absolutely.
in this country.
Yeah, that's Fraser Nelson's documentary.
Yeah. And if we're flooding the country with migrants to fill these jobs, there seems to be an obvious alternative solution to filling these positions.
Do you know how much we're paying on welfare in this country?
Is it? Well, I thought it was in it. Was it like 60 billion?
Keep going. 90 billion.
90 billion.
We are spending more on welfare
than education,
than defense. Think about that.
Well, I mean,
Russia, China, North Korea, we are spending more keeping people on benefits, on our benefits system, than defense.
Yeah, the defense doesn't worry me too much because I think we're such a small fuck nation anyway. If a war kicks off, we're going to need the protection of bigger countries.
But in terms of national priorities, it sends a message.
Well, I always look to education. The education is my benchmark, so I know we spend more on debt interest than education.
Yeah.
Now you're saying we spend more on welfare than education. I always look at education. Yeah. That to me is like, that is the future. That's where we should be. Okay, so...
But just on the debt point, this goes back, this is really, this is the benefit of a long-form conversation because this, again, wouldn't come up. Most people don't even mention debt in Westminster discussions. But again, it's a legacy of the left-right consensus. Nobody really was saying during the 2010s, well, in the second half of the 2010s through COVID, what's going to happen when all this debt becomes more expensive? So now where we are is not only have we got a debt to GDP ratio of 100, 101%, and people say, oh, it doesn't matter, it's all relative. Look at France, they're really fucked. But actually, it really matters because we are spending billions in interest payments on our debt, which is billions we can't spend on the NHS, we can't spend on education. I mean, it is bonkers.
This is the thing that drives me mad.
125%,
Yeah, and I know that 135% is our event horizon. The numbers might change now, but historically, this is just from my friend Lynn Alden. She says of the 52 countries that have hit 135% debt to GDP, only one has not had a currency default, which is Japan, which is pretty much fucked. Like, you always end up with a currency default. It's the thing that makes me most angry. I know what the issue is. They cannot control spend, and you have a limitation on taxation. But kind of borrowing more money is easy. It's kind of, people don't really understand it. They don't really understand not enough people understand that's going to drive inflation. It is actually the most, I think, one of the most evil taxes. This is why I think we need this absolute kind of like cutthroat approach to government. We need what they do with Doge in the US.
Absolutely.
This is bonkers. This is the stuff that drives. This is why I keep all my money in Bitcoin.
But to be blunt, even if you were to apply Doge to the UK and you were going to say, okay, it's crazy that we've got 500 quangos in this country, quasi-autonomous, non-elected government organizations, right? It's kind of the blob. Call it the blob. So you could slash that by 50%. You could rewire Whitehall. You could make it more efficient, leaner.
Yep.
But it's not going to deal with the debt problem. You're going to clear some waste.
Yeah.
We need basically,
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
We don't just need to reform the institutions. We need a counter elite, right? We have an elite class that has no serious opposition, right? From the Treasury to number 10 to the business class, they basically all think the same. And where I think we need to go is where Trump is going now. Compare Trump 1 and Trump 2. Trump 1 was not a disaster, but it wasn't great because they couldn't control the corridors of power. They had all these ideas, but then Trump came in and realized, actually, if you can't control the levers of power and the offices of state, you're not going to get anything done. Trump 2 has recognized that the first order problem in Western democracies is the state and who controls the state. The second order problems are mass migration, the economy, violent Islamism, geopolitical tensions, whatever. They're all second order problems. The first order problem is reforming, reconfiguring the state and making it responsive to ordinary people. Now, in Britain, if we're right that Britain is going to go where America's going, who in the political class, media class, is even making that argument that we need to fundamentally rewire the state, the British state, gut the waste, change the thinking, push back against this consensus that's governed this country for 30 years, right? Have a completely different approach to managing the corridors of power so that the institutions actually work for the forgotten majority. That's what we need. That's what we need in this country, is a counter elite, not just another conservative leader who appoints exactly the same people that Boris Johnson had around him. Like, forget that. That's not going to work. Everybody knows that's not going to work. We need a completely different counter elite, like a new elite.
Okay, so a counter elite, which is going to be a decentralized form of media, it's independent media, independent voices that will educate those who don't understand, but build kind of consensus around ideas. I'm with you on that. I do hold a contempt for government, but at the same time, I'm intrigued by what Reform are doing. I've looked at their policies. One thing I will ask about Reform at the moment is, I feel like now is their biggest and best opportunity, but it feels like they've been fracturing a bit recently. They're not coalescing around like a single set of ideas. I think the Ben Habib situation was sad. I think the way Nigel dealt with it publicly was sad. I think Rupert's doing amazing things, but I just kind of feel like there's such an opportunity right now, but there's a little bit of like infighting or fracturing going on, and that's like, now's not the time. Or is now the time to do that and figure that out ready for in 3 years' time?
I think if you look at new political parties and you look at insurgent political parties, they kind of go through 3 phases. You get your breakthrough phase where you just start winning elections and seats in office. You get your consolidation phase where you're like, okay, maybe we need better people at the center. Maybe we need a long-term strategy. Maybe we need to, flesh out our policy in more detail. Then you have a power phase where you get a chance, thirdly, to implement your project in the corridors of power. And I think what you can see with Reform is they've kind of gone through or still going through in a way, the breakthrough phase. They're starting to move now into consolidation, which is, okay, how are we going to hold this thing together, and how are we going to get a better quality of people at the center? That's not to say there's anything wrong with the people who've been working with Reform until now, but it is to say that what I think Nigel Farage has taken from Trump, and remember, Farage was the only person in the room in Mar-a-Lago on the night of the US election. Like, that's how close and influential he is in the US. But I think that has allowed him to see that what Trump has, and he has never really had through the UKIP days and through the Brexit Party days, is a serious, credible team of people who are aligned ideologically with what he's trying to do. Now, if he can get that, and he does not just rely on ex-Tories, but he can build a team who are loyal, who are competent, who are credible, who can actually devise policy, who have experience of governance, who can understand that this is at its heart an anti-establishment rebellion. It's not just a Tory tribute act. It has to be above left and right. It has to be beyond London, Kent and Essex. It has to be a genuine revolt. If he is able to put that into place, and he's the only person who can do it, there is no other alternative, then they will move through consolidation into power. I genuinely believe if they put the pieces together, they could completely reshape politics in this country in 2029, because all realignments are about demand and supply. You've got to have the demand from voters, which is clearly there. People are so hacked off with this system, but you've got to have the supply. You've got to have the credible, coherent, competent alternative that voters can look at and go, yeah, I'm going to take a punt on that. Now, I don't think anyone in Reform would say as well that they've got that supply side message and organization nailed down yet. But I think they are closer, and Nigel is closer to getting that than he's ever been in his career.
How many MPs do they realistically need to find to stand a chance in the next election?
To reshape? Well, look, I mean, it depends if you...
Are we talking hundreds?
I think so sequencing matters in politics. You would need to win hundreds of seats to win the next general election, right? You would need to basically not only replace the Tories, but you would need to smash Labour in the Red Wall in Wales. It's an enormous undertaking, right? It's huge. Let's call that the maximalist approach of doing everything in one election. Like, it's very difficult to find a point in history where that's happened. If you think about Labour replacing the Liberals in the early 20th century, or you think about the Reform Party replacing the Progressive Conservatives in Canada, those revolts have actually taken 2 or 3 election cycles to build up over time. So it might be that Reform will say, okay, you've got 5 now, we'll win Wales in 2026. We'll get a few more MPs through defections and by-elections. And then in 2029, we're going to aim to win, going to throw everything at winning the election. It may be that we end up with 100 MPs or we replace the Tories. And that is part of this credibility story, which is then your stepping stone into taking over the whole thing. Sequencing matters in politics.
That's fucking 8-9 more years of Labour, man.
And that is the biggest obstacle and barrier to any new entrant in the first past the post system. We ain't in France here. We ain't in the Netherlands. We are in a system that is designed to produce two-party outcomes. Now, if you're a third party, fourth party, it is a nightmare, utter nightmare to break through in that system. Not impossible. I still think, reform on a good day, this could happen. You throw in a fiscal event, you throw in chaos at the borders, God forbid you throw in some internal problems, the likes of which we saw over the summer. I think the frustration in this country could parachute Farage to a place he's never gone before as a frontline politician. I genuinely believe that. And I've studied and analysed politics for most of my adult life. But I've also watched countless parties throw themselves at this system, and for it to slap them in the face and say, now, until you get to that tipping point where you really do take on Labour and the Conservatives, it's very, very, very difficult to do.
At Ledden, we built the best Bitcoin-backed loan platform in the world. Proven, trusted, growing. Ledden's proven track record speaks for itself. Visit ledden.io/Mr. Obnoxious to get started. Ledden, there is no second best. Ledden is not regulated in the United Kingdom. Any credit products or virtual asset services provided by Ledden are not subject to UK regulatory protections. Please consider the risks associated with virtual assets and consult a financial advisor before making any decisions.
Could you see a scenario where we end up with a reform conservative coalition, and would that be a good or a bad thing for you, in your eyes?
Well, my view would be it would simply be a disaster for reform to do a deal or a pact with the Conservative Party, because they could be so much bigger than the Conservative Party. Okay. It's almost like not understanding their own worth and value if they were to do that, because it would confirm in the minds of voters that they're basically a Tory tribute act. My advice to them would be hold your nerve, build up as much as you can between now and 2029. Throw yourselves at this once in a lifetime opportunity. They're going to smash the Tories apart in Wales in 2026. They're going to smash the Tories apart at local elections. They're going to look like a viable alternative in the Red Wall, where no one's going to vote Tory in 29. They're going to look like a really compelling alternative in the coastal towns in Kent and Essex, in parts of, outer London and some areas like that. But it is about the leadership standing back and saying, okay, to really deliver on this, we need a small group of highly committed, ideologically aligned people who get the long-term strategy, not just how do you get on, not how do you build a brand, but how do you execute a 5 to 10 year strategy? I'll give you an example. You look at, say, what Marine Le Pen is doing in France. She's on the cusp of basically her or Jordan Bardella becoming prime minister or president in a not too distant future,
if they don't jail her.
This has been the culmination of a carefully, meticulously crafted strategy for the last 10 to 20 years. Le Pen famously has her brains trust, 15 to 20 serious economists, historians, political analysts who are constantly giving her advice and shaping the message and thinking about where the party's going. You have to have that ruthless discipline. And also, by the way, ruthless discipline in terms of lifestyle. Like, there has to be utter dedication to smashing this two-party system apart. It has to be.
One of the things I was going to ask you earlier, I never got around to, going back to the idea of populism, is the term is often used by certain quarters in media and politics as a pejorative. They'll say, oh, they're just right-wing populists. Right-wing itself has been a pejorative. But I've always felt like, well, the populism is just a democratic response to people feeling disenfranchised. And I think it's perhaps been weaponized as a way to kind of degrade the opinions of the electorate, parts of the electorate who feel like, what the fuck's going on here? I feel unheard.
Well, I think populism is anchored in a very different conception of what democracy is. So there are two competing views of democracy. There's what we might call the elite conception of democracy, which argues that the true source of power and authority and legitimacy lies with elites. And so the relationship is horizontal. It goes from one group of elites in Davos to another group of elites in Westminster to another group of elites in Washington. And they basically shape and decide determine the outcome of their societies by engaging with other elites. A populist conception of democracy instead argues that the true source of power, the true source of authority and legitimacy lies not with the elites, but with the people. And so the relationship is vertical. Populists believe that power runs from the people to the people that they elect to represent them and speak on their behalf. So the relationship there is vertical. It's what you might call a sort of direct conception of democracy that says what really matters is putting the majority will, putting the forgotten majority first when thinking through policy decisions, not putting people from other countries or other elite communities before your own people. So the reason the elite class look down on populism is because they can see that it is rooted in this principle of popular sovereignty. And to be frank, they either don't like or don't understand the wishes and aspirations of ordinary people. And they will, if you were to clip this and I were to share it, they say, oh, this is rubbish. Oh, I don't agree with that. But we've seen it. We saw it after the Brexit referendum.
We did.
We saw it after the Trump victory. We saw it after the second Trump victory. We saw them calling voters garbage. We saw them saying that people who questioned Labour were bigots. We saw them calling us gammons and Karens and all the rest of it. We've seen all of this.
It's the contempt they have.
It's like talking about people out loud while they're in the room with you, right? That's what has happened over the last 10 years. And then they will look down on populism because fundamentally they will look down on people they do not consider to be as morally righteous, as morally virtuous as they are. So it is a contempt. And there's a lot of evidence for this. There are studies that show elite graduates from Oxford, Cambridge, the LSE, look down on people who do not belong to the elite graduate community that they belong to because they basically view their identity as a kind of educated, enlightened member of the liberal elite class as being absolutely everything to them. It is their achieved identity. Whereas most people in the country have an ascribed identity. They say, actually, yeah, I mean, if I go to uni, yeah, whatever, but actually I care about my town. I care about my group. I care about my country. I care about, the things that I belong to. Rory Stewart, doesn't think like that, right? But Nigel Farage thinks like that. And that's fundamentally the difference. It's the anywheres and the somewheres. And the elite class, as David Goodhart, the British writer, once said, the elite class are basically dominated by anywheres. They would be as happy doing a podcast in London as they would be doing a podcast in Rome, New York, Los Angeles, Martha's Vineyard or wherever. Whereas actually, I wouldn't feel as comfortable and as happy living in France, Pakistan, Zimbabwe, or America as I feel when I'm, walking through the countryside in England. That's like my place, that's my home. But they don't think like that.
It's interesting because my two favorite politicians are, I don't know, you might completely understand this, I'm not getting it at all, are Nigel Farage, bear with me, and Angela Rayner. I completely disagree with Angela Rayner almost every policy decision. Not everything, but they're two people I believe they're actually kind of real humans.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to interview Angela. I think I'd get really well with her and disagree with her. But I believe she believes in what she's saying and what she stands for. And yes, she might get corrupted along the way, but I believe she does. And that's why I like Nigel. And I get a lot of shit from some parts of my family and friendship groups, but I still believe he's I've met him, I've hung out with him. I think he's a real person. I then look across the rest of the spectrum of politics, and I'm not saying there's nobody, but I really struggle to find people I go, oh, I think you understand what I care about in Bedford or what people in London care about. I think we've lacked that. We've just seemed to have created this, I don't know, group of career politicians who are entirely focused on what they want out of life rather than what they should be doing, which is serving us, the people. And I just want it all fucking smashed apart. Actually, I mean, I can put Rupert Lowe in there because I think he's a real person.
I think there are people in politics who are good people, who are real and authentic. I think also Westminster does something to people. You know, it's an extreme subculture. I mean, it is really it's a habitat that is incredibly insular, homogenous. I mean, it is not a great place for serious dialogue and discussion, and you know, it's I don't find it very enjoyable or comfortable to be in. And if you go to most of the media parties, I think you get a very good idea as to how insular and stifling
media
that culture
parties?
really is. Like, you know, parties for the media class, like, you know, Christmas parties for various newspapers and magazines and whatever. And when you're there, you're like, wow, this really is so disconnected from the rest of the country.
If you were talking to a traditional conservative voter now, what would you say to them?
If I was talking to a disconnected conservative voter and a disconnected Labour voter,
not even disconnected,
just
engaged.
Currently, time to vote for somebody else. Time to change the system. Yeah, 100%. There's no point if you're endorsing this. If you don't like the country the way it is now, like, it's on you. You've been voting for it. You know,
it is a great question to put to people. Are you happy with the state of the country, and do you think it's improved over the last 10 to 20 years?
Well, it's a Ronald Reagan question. Like, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? But, you know, do you think fundamentally the country is better than it was when you were growing up? And do you think Britain, do you think England is, do you think they're moving in the right direction? I think if I asked that as a pollster, I think probably 75-80% of this country, maybe 90% would say, no, I don't think this country is moving in the right direction. Well, then stop voting for the parties that are pushing you in that direction. Vote for a party that's going to push you in a different direction. That's what I would say. You have to, at some point, you have to stop looking at the mechanical logic of the system, and you have to just start exercising your voice as a citizen, you know, and just put tactical considerations to one side and say, okay, I'm actually now going to consciously rebel and remove myself from this consensus. I'm not going to participate in this thing anymore. This is not what I want to be a part of. That's what I would recommend.
And if you I mean, like, a vision you would have for the future, obviously immigration is one, but what do you think based, I mean, I've got reforms outline manifesto here, but I mean, there's a lot in it, but where would you focus attention? I know you said immigration.
Well, to me, it's the number one issue in a country, and it feeds into so much else, from the housing crisis to the economy. I think for me, having a robust, serious policy in terms of how to end the experiment of mass immigration is the most important thing a party like Reform should have, without question. And like, I know what I would do. I mean, I would have an immediate freeze on all non-essential migration. By non-essential, I mean immigration that directly relates to the National Health Service and existing high-skilled worker visas. I wouldn't even talk about, net zero migration. I don't think that really works for me. I'd have an immediate freeze on all non-essential migration. I would then switch instantly overnight to a high-skill migration policy from culturally compatible nations. And I would scrap the indefinite leave to remain. I would reinsert in the housing sector a preference for British families, particularly large British families, because we have a fertility crisis that we haven't even talked about yet. I would have a principle embedded in as much of the economy as I can that British families, British workers, and British taxpayers come first. I would radically overhaul our benefits system so it does not pay to live on benefits, and I would move as many of those 9 million people who are not working or who are suffering from mental health conditions and so forth into the workplace, right? And it would be a completely different economic environment. And it would be a complete break from the status quo. I'd also consider doing things like, I'd also leave the ECHR. I'd reform the Human Rights Act.
Because of the migrant.
Yeah,
issue.
I'd leave the European Convention on Human Rights so we can control our own borders and deport foreign national offenders. I'd reinstall an active deterrent, not necessarily the Rwanda scheme, but something like it, but which also ring-fence the supremacy of UK law. I would also ban cousin marriage. I would bring in life sentences for people involved in grooming gangs, not because I think that in itself will change anything, but I think it's time we started sending signals that this is Britain. We have a rule of law. We have a way of life. We're not tolerating people who are not going to respect that way of life. There's a whole host of things that I would do. But then if you have those ideas, you then have to look at the political parties, and there will never be a party that completely reflects and mirrors everything you want to do in the country. But there might be a vehicle that you can look at and think, on balance, if I get involved with that, if I get behind that, I can shape that, and I can bend the system in my direction a little bit more. And okay, maybe I only agree with 70% of what they say or 80% of what they say. But that to me looks like the most compelling vehicle that can be used to bend the system in my direction.
Okay. Last area, and it's another one I struggle with, is Islam. We have, a significantly sized British Muslim population. Like you, I know a number of nice, moderate Muslims, but there certainly has been and some people argue rightly so, but there certainly has been a ring fencing around a particular issue with Islam, and sometimes it feels like it's a catch-all for all Muslims. I don't see a world where we don't have Muslims in our country anymore. What is the fair and best way to deal with what is perceived as a large issue with a number of people?
Well, firstly, this issue is only going to get a lot bigger. If you look at the forecasts of where we're going by the Pew Research Center, which is a centrist, independent, credible research institute, they forecast that by 2050, Britain will see the largest overall increase in the absolute number of Muslims of all European nations. Basically, the population will double, essentially.
But based on the growth of...
Based on current forecasts like population growth, birth rates,
not migration, or you include migration?
A bit of both, including when they did the numbers, they were assuming net migration was a little bit lower than it is now, but so probably the numbers are underestimating where we're going. So it's only going to become a bigger issue. I say that because of what I say is number two, which is we therefore need a sensible, serious national conversation about how we are going to integrate Islam into British life, how we are going to manage this process in a way that does not erode or compromise the things that make us who we are. Our history, our identity, our values, our way of life. So what am I saying? I'm saying you're never going to be in a position where, and nor I wouldn't want to be in this position where you just don't have any people from different religions and backgrounds in Britain. I think that's like a ridiculous thing to say or to want to see. But the interesting policy question now is, how are you going to manage this profound change while inserting red lines that make it clear we're not going to have parallel legal systems in this country. We're not going to have parallel cultural systems in this country. We are going to have one legal, cultural, political system, and that is going to be our system. We're not going to have blasphemy laws. We're not going to have cousin marriage. We're not going to have alternative courts. And we're not going to have schools being taken to court like Michaela Free School was because they wanted a neutral area for children and they didn't want to have some children praying and other children not praying. We're not going to have the courts and the legal system being weaponized. We're not going to have sectarianism at our elections. We're not going to have candidates being elected just simply because they hold particular views on issues around Gaza. Like, that's not who we are. We have national general elections. We don't have sectarian elections in that way. So that is going to be the next big debate in our country. And by next, I mean for the next 25 years, this is going to be a debate. I was struck by reading, you know, I've said this before in interviews. I read Ed Hussein's book, Among the Mosques, and I think Ed Hussein is a very interesting, reasonable thinker. And I was always struck by what he said in that book, and also what people like the Casey report have said, Louise Casey's report, you know, that if you're a young British Muslim, you can spend your entire day walking around your neighborhood, the mosque, institutions, schools, and have almost no interaction, if any interaction, with people from the non-Muslim majority. That is a damning indictment of the failure of multiculturalism and integration in our society. That is a recipe for disaster. Mm-hmm. We do not want to be, as Trevor Phillips once said, sleepwalking to segregation. But if we don't want to sleepwalk into segregation, we need to wake up and have a serious, difficult conversation about, okay, what are we going to do without, you know, because what you're going to see with this Labour government is, guaranteed, they're going to expand these non-crime hate incidents. Yvette Cooper's already said she's going to do that. So if after this interview you get on the phone and you call the police and say, oh, I just think Matt Goodwin said something offensive on my podcast and it was about my race or my religion or my sexual orientation or my gender, and the police say, oh God, right, we better make a little note on Matt Goodwin's record. So if I ever go for a job in the public sector, you know, I've got a black mark next to my name because you filed
you're already
one of
on
these
a
things.
list. You're on a list. You're on a list.
And they're going to expand those.
Yeah. They're
going to expand the definition of Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Where it's going to be a de facto blasphemy law. So if you and I have this conversation, say, well, you know what? I'm really uncomfortable with cousin marriage. I'm really uncomfortable with Sharia courts. Maybe this podcast gets shut down. Maybe there's a problem. Maybe it's perceived. Maybe that criticism is perceived as Islamophobia. That's where we're heading. So that's why I say this is going to be one of the biggest debates. And it's already happening. Germany, France, Italy, Sweden. There is an emerging debate now about how we are going to manage one of the biggest demographic and cultural transformations Europe has ever gone through.
We need a constitution, not the Magna Carta. I've often envied the US Constitution with all its failings, and I'm not somebody who wants guns here. It's not something high on my agenda.
I certainly don't want guns here.
But I do want constitutionally protected speech.
Well,
I do want limitations on government.
Let's see. But hopefully what these conversations also are about is, you know, that conversation has already started. You can tune into podcasts like this and start thinking about what's coming down the line. You can read outside of the legacy media and start thinking about things. Because the other thing, just lastly to say, is of all the big debates that have filtered into mainstream legacy media, they've often started in what we would call the new media ecosystem like this. You know, if you think about the way in which eventually, you know, the gender madness has been taken on by journalists at the Times, or, you know, grooming gangs have eventually been criticized by, you know, the Telegraph and journalists at the time. Well, where did all that stuff start? It started in the new media ecosystem. Mm-hmm. It started in viral clips and videos. It started with renegades and pioneers saying, yeah, well, we're not going to teach little boys that they can become little girls, or we've got an industrial scale problem in Northern England we need to talk about. It didn't start in the legacy institutions. It started from outside of the legacy institutions. So, yeah, this is just a conversation on one podcast, but in a way it's contributing to something that is actually, it is a seed that is growing into something that is critically important in terms of changing the culture and the zeitgeist.
You not thought of running?
Who knows?
Who knows? All right. Matt, this is fantastic. Really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot from you. And like I said, I really enjoy your Substack. Tell people where to go for that.
They can just Google Matt Goodwin Substack. They'll find it.
Yeah. populistrevolt.org. Go find it. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. Enjoy this conversation. Thank you so much.
Me too. Thank you. Wish you every success with the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for listening. See you soon.